Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in the next of our series of definitions. Today is going to be part one of two for taking a drop. My name is Jason Funderburg. I'm joined by the entire tournament department. Chris Roselle and Kirby Martin are going to be helping answer questions that you guys submit that we can't get to during the broadcast. And today's presenter is going to be Neil Gilman, tournament director. Just a quick reminder again, folks, this is part one of two. So if you want to finish today's, be sure to sign up for tomorrow's webinar as well. Today's webinar and all of our webinars are recorded and going to be posted at gapgolf.org/gap-webinars and can be viewed a couple hours after the fact. And again, we encourage any and all questions that you may have. There is a questions tab in your window pane there of the GoToWebinar app. So be sure to fire away. If we don't get to it today during the presentation, like I said, we will get back to you personally. So without further ado, Neil, you want to get us kicked off here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jason. And thanks everybody in attendance. I know it probably isn't the most exciting topic to be doing first thing Monday morning, but it's something to do that breaks the monotony. So yeah, we're going to get underway here about taking a drop and some of the relief procedures. Today, we're going to be talking about free relief. So we've got three sections. We've got, as you can see, free relief, no relief, and some reference points for free relief. We are, like I said, tackling free relief. Therefore, we've got quite a few things to cover. So as Jason said, if you've got any questions that don't get answered today, we will jump on those either after today or during tomorrow's presentation. So one of the first concepts we'll cover is an abnormal course condition. And as you can see here, there are 4 defined conditions that meet that definition of abnormal course condition: the animal hole, ground under repair, an movable obstruction, and temporary water. An abnormal course condition also has its own rule, Rule 16, that really talks about it in depth in the relief procedures that go into where your drop may be and where you can get. But to better understand the first defined condition there, an animal hole, we kind of have to know what an animal is under the rules of golf. So an animal is any living member of the animal kingdom other than humans, including mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and any invertebrates. This such includes worms, insects, spiders, and crustaceans. So, despite that being from Caddyshack right there on the left of the bottom left of your screen, insinuating that groundhog is a living member of the animal kingdom, we would get relief from his animal hole, as we'll discover in this next slide. So what is an animal hole? It's any hole dug in the ground by an animal, as we just defined, except for the holes dug by animals that are also defined as loose impediments, such as worms or insects. As we'll kind of get into it later when we talk about loose impediments, when worms or insects, dig into the ground, their debris from them digging is a little bit different than what we're determining to be an animal hole. But again, we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about loose impediments. So the term animal hole includes any loose material that the animal dug out of the hole. Really good example is sometimes you see turtles that make burrowing in the sand. You can see kind of the example on the top of your screen is some of that loose material or loose dirt that was made when that animal was digging their hole. Any worn down track or trail leading into the hole, again, using that example of turtles, they generally move the sand and push it off to the side, creating a path or a hollow that your ball may rest in. And then any area that's pushed up or altered as a result of the animal digging a hole underground. So this is our groundhog here, and he is creating quite a few bumps in our surface, whether that be on the putting green or our fairway. We can take the relief as needed under an abnormal course condition. So another element under abnormal course condition, and it has its own definition, is ground under repair. Any part of the course which the committee defines to be ground under repair, whether marking it or otherwise. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more, some of the other ways you can define ground under repair. This gentleman to the bottom right is PJ Boatwright, a longtime USGA committee member. If you ever heard of the Boatwright internship, he's developed, that was named in his legacy, and quite a few of the Gulf administration personnel around the country had one time served as a PJ Boatwright. Any defined ground under repair includes both the ground inside the edge of the defined area, and then our first really challenging concept here is any grass, bush, tree, or other growing or attached natural object that is rooted in the defined area, including any part of those objects that extend up above the ground outside the edge of the defined area. So a lot of words, but what we're trying to say here is if a tree or a bush is growing in or is rooted in a defined ground under repair area and extends its limbs or branch extends outside that defined area, as long as it's rooted in there, we're going to give the relief as necessary. But we do have a bit of an exception here, and that's really, but when it is attached to the ground or is below the ground outside the edge of the defined area. Obviously, tree roots being big and wide spreading, we're not going to give relief for as long as that tree is rooted. So if the root extends outside the defined area of ground under repair and is not marked within that said area, and again, we'll get into how we define an area of ground under repair, we're not going to give relief for that. So you don't really see many branches that extend downward like that, but it's really, you think about it as the roots that extend outside that defined ground under repair. There are also some other things that are ground under repair, even if the committee doesn't mark them as such. There's some areas that we won't notice, or there's some areas that, again, like this is saying, meets the definition that we don't have to define via white lines or stakes or on a notice to competitors. Our first example is any hole made by a committee or maintenance staff. So for example, here on your right of your screen, you see this player removing a penalty area stake in which that stake will leave a hole in the ground. Should the player's ball have interference from that hole, that meets the definition of ground under repair. They doesn't have to, again, have those white lines or stakes around it. Another example here, and this is a different kind of concept, and Kirby covered it a little bit last week if you joined us, is a hole, the actual physical hole on a double green being used for play of a different hole is a hole made by the committee or the maintenance staff that we're going to get relief from. Your relief's going to be a little bit different as you're going to be playing, you're not going to be playing from a wrong green, but that hole is actually part of ground under repair. Another area is maintaining the golf course. So if you see this area here on the right of your screen, these gentlemen are working on the golf course. The committee would be wise to mark all the equipment as well, and some of the tracks that those heavy cars and tractors might make as part of the ground under repair with lines and or stakes. But if this area were to go unmarked, it would meet the definition of ground under repair. So in part of maintaining the course, a hole in removing turf or a tree stump or laying pipelines is meeting that definition of ground under repair. However, this doesn't include aeration holes. The those aeration holes, if your ball rests in it, does not meet ground under repair in this example. Grass cuttings, leaves, and any other material piled for later removal meets the definition of ground under repair here. I think one of the first examples when I was taught the rules was that if you find this at Augusta National, it's not piled for later removal. That was there, it was set there. But you might see this somewhere, a stack of leaves or a stack of grass cuttings that are like this example adjacent to a cart path to make sure that there's somebody coming by and picking those materials up. However, any natural materials that are piled for removal are also loose impediments. So you could be off the fairway in an area that is not heavily trafficked. It's where the maintenance staff dumps these said grass clippings. They are indeed loose impediments that if you wanted to remove them, you may. Obviously, there's going to be limitations on what you can do if they are adhering to the ball, but they are loose impediments, so you can move them. Any materials left on the course that are not intended to be removed are not ground under repair unless the committee has defined them as such. So the committee could come in and make all these areas ground under repair, but they don't have to, and they don't meet the definition of ground under repair. And another one here is any animal habitat, such as a bird's nest, so that it's so near to a player's ball that the player's stroke or stance might damage it. We're not going to expect you to play from that. We're going to get you relief from away from their habitat. But as we alluded to earlier, when the habitat has been made by animals that are defined as loose impediments, such as worms and insects, that's going to be our lone exception to where you're not going to get ground under repair relief for that. Again, this example on the right of your screen will show these worm casts that have been made possibly after a rainstorm. We're going to define those as loose impediments, but we are not going to give you ground under repair relief for that being an animal's habitat. Here we'll start talking about how a ground under repair area should be defined. So for this example, we are defining our ground under repair by stakes. When defined by stakes, the edge of the ground under repair is defined by the line between the outside points of the stakes at ground level, and the stakes are inside the ground under repair. So that basically is saying that the outermost edge of those stakes is where the ground under repair starts and stops. Anything inside and including those stakes is our ground under repair. However, if you're playing in one of our gap championships, we're going to do our best to identify all the ground under repair by lines. When defined by painted line on the ground, the edge of the ground under repair and the outside edge of the line and the line itself is in the ground under repair. So if you remember again from one of our webinars last week, we talked about penalty areas and out of bounds lines. This is similar to a penalty area. When your ball is on that line, you're in that area, in that condition. So it's a good way to remember it when you're on the golf course. There's also times where you can define ground under repair by some of the physical features that are represented there on the golf course. I look at this example here, and while the area is mulched and there is a noticeable edge between the part of that general area and that mulched area, sometimes you see there's metal fencings or the short metal fencing, so that you can use that as a determination of where the ground under repair stops and starts. But when we're defining by physical features, such as a flower bed or a turf nursery, committee should say how the edge of the ground under repair is defined. It would be wise of the committee on the notice to competitors or the information handed out to the players before they begin their day, how these areas are defined. When the edge of the ground under repair is defined by lines or physical features, stakes may be used to show where the ground under repair is, but then they have no other meaning. So in this example, physical features and lines will always trump stakes if both are present. If just stakes are there, those will be our determining factors of where that ground under repair starts and stops. However, if stakes and lines are present, stakes are merely there just to identify the ground under repair for yourself as you approach that area. Jason, I think that's our first question slide. So anything so far?
Yep, just one question here. It looks like Kirby and Chris did a good job answering it, but I figured it'd be a good one for the crowd. Is a deer or other animal track in a sand trap considered an animal hole?
So yes, the tracks themselves, if it's an anomaly, it could not be. So if a one-off footprint is not in the, if a one-off footprint is just in there, it's a different story. But when the animal tracks themselves are animal, I believe they, correct me if I'm wrong, Kirby and Chris, they meet the ground under repair rules. Okay. Jason, do you want to have anything else, or should we keep moving?
No other questions here, but I do have Chris's typed answer, so I guess I can read it out. An isolated animal footprint that is not leading into an animal hole is not a hole made by an animal, but rather an irregularity of the surface from which relief without penalty is not allowed. However, when such damage is on the putting green, it may be repaired. So along the lines of what you were saying there, Neil.
Great. Thanks, Chris, for answering that. So we'll keep moving along here. Jumping into our next section here, temporary water, another abnormal course condition. Before the 2019 revision of the rules, it was known as casual water. Temporary water is any temporary accumulation of water on the surface of the ground, such as puddles from rain or irrigation, or an overflow from a body of water. It is not part of the penalty area. So that said, it could be in the teeing area, the general area, a bunker, or even on the putting green. But water within the penalty area's margins doesn't meet temporary water. So how can you identify when you have temporary water? Well, it can be seen before or after the player takes their stance, without pressing down excessively with his or her feet. You know, it's really about seeing that water there when you're taking your stance. However, it is not enough for the ground to be merely wet, muddy, or soft. I think we get into some of these areas where you know the course is draining into one area. However, if we're not seeing water and we can hear the water, that's not merely enough. We need to be able to see that water when we're taking our stance. The water can't just be momentarily visible either as the player steps on the ground. We can see that from time to time again when you just take your stance and the water comes up out of the ground, but it doesn't hold there, it doesn't stay there. We know the water's underneath. However, it is not temporary water if it then recedes back into the ground. It would need to be there for an elapsed period of time. And then again, an accumulation of water must remain present either before or after the stroke is taken. There are some special cases though, as I think we've talked about in previous webinars. Dew and frost are not temporary water, and snow or ice, other than frost, are either at the player's discretion, loose impediments, or when on the ground, temporary water at the player's option. There's some brave souls that go out there when there's snow and natural ice on the ground, and you have the opportunity to choose what you like to do with that snow or natural ice if you were to get into that situation. That being said, manufactured ice is actually an obstruction. If you get into a situation where there's a ice sculpture, that would probably meet the definition of an immovable obstruction, which is something we will talk about just a little bit later in this presentation. We'll jump into now another free relief situation, embedded ball. The player's ball is embedded in its own pitch mark, made as a result of the player's previous stroke, and where part of the ball is below the level of the ground. One of my things that I realize that the rules say is that the ball has to get airborne for the ball to be embedded on the previous stroke. But you can see here in this example that part of the ball is below the surface of the ground. And as you can see in our next example, that a ball doesn't necessarily have to touch the soil to be embedded. The examples given to us here are grass or loose impediments, maybe between the ball and the soil. This happens quite a bit when you have some wet surfaces and you get some grass that comes down in between the ball and the soil. So we'll jump into obstructions. As many of you know, there are immovable obstructions, and there are immovable and movable obstructions, as well as temporary and movable obstructions. We'll hold on to the temporary and movable obstructions for another day, but today we'll just talk about immovable or movable. So an obstruction is any artificial object except for an integral object or boundary object. So an integral object could be something that the committee defines, and as a boundary object is not considered an obstruction. So we'll get into some examples of what obstructions may be, some artificially surfaced roads and paths, including their borders. So if you were to have a path with a curbing, that curbing is also going to be part of that same obstruction. Maintenance buildings, rain shelters, bathrooms that will be out on the golf course will be determined to be an obstruction. Some other common ones would be sprinkle heads, drains, irrigation, or their control boxes. Stakes, walls, railings, and fences. Fences is used here in a general term, but again, we're not talking about boundary objects. Sometimes you'll see split rail fences out on the golf course that don't define boundaries, but they're just there to control some traffic, whether it be cart or foot traffic. We'll get into how those can be moved around. However, those would be considered an obstruction. Golf carts, mowers, cars, and other vehicles could be defined as obstructions so long as they are part of the golf course. They are on that golf course, and they have just been left there. Waste containers, signposts, and benches are other things that could be defined as obstructions. Specifically, we might define them again as movable or immovable, but as of now, we are defining them as an obstruction. And last but not least, players' equipment, a flag stick, and rakes are also obstructions. Again, like I had said, there are movable and immovable obstructions. However, if part of an immovable obstruction, such as a gate or a door of an attached cable, meets the definition of a movable obstruction, that part is treated as movable. For this example, we're saying this fence is not a boundary object, but we're saying it is a movable obstruction. Well, the gate itself is movable. So if the player wishes, he or she may make that part movable and take and may play their shot, or they may take the relief if the immovable obstruction is they have interference from that. So some more movable obstructions here, and really what a movable obstruction is an obstruction that can be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the course for that matter. Some examples you have down here below. I think we've all have a story of a ball that has gotten into a golf cart one way or another, a ball resting against a rake, or even possibly on a player's equipment, as you see in the bottom left of your screen. All these items are determined to be movable, and there is a specific relief procedure in how to handle those. But we can do these with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the golf course. If part of an immovable obstruction, such as a gate or door of an attached cable, meets two standards, again, that part is treated as a movable obstruction. However, this does not apply if the movable part of the movable obstruction is not meant to be moved. So here you kind of see a stone wall. The stone wall has multiple pilings of this stone. The idea is you're not allowed within the rules to remove multiple stones of this stone wall to make that object an immovable, or to make an immovable obstruction. Even when the obstruction is movable, the committee, however, may define it as an immovable obstruction. So we talked about split rail fences here, some previous slides. And you can see here in the bottom right of our screen that the split rail fences continue for some time. If the committee defines those all as movable obstructions instead of taking apart and jeopardizing the structure of those fences, the committee may do so, making it an immovable obstruction and therefore requiring you to take relief as opposed to moving that obstruction. So an immovable obstruction is an obstruction that cannot be moved without unreasonable effort or without damaging the obstruction or the course, and otherwise does not meet the definition of an obstruction. So as you can see here in our example there, we have a water fountain. The player is not expected to play around or on this water fountain. It is being treated as an immovable obstruction, and they will get the appropriate relief as needed. And again, the committee may define any obstruction to be an immovable obstruction, even if it meets the definition of a movable obstruction. Jason, any questions before we jump into our last section?
Yeah, we got a couple sitting here for us. So along the same lines of what you were just talking about, can you open a gate that's part of the boundary?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll have Chris and Kirby chime in because this is something that actually also confuses me. But part of that boundary object, unless it is deemed to be part of that gate, is part of the boundary object, can be moved. I believe that is correct, Chris and Kirby?
Yep, that's correct.
Great. Let's move down the line here. If a ball is against a movable obstruction, moves as a result of removing the obstruction, is the ball replaced or played where it lies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in taking relief from an movable obstruction, the player should mark the position of the ball. And for this example, let's say the ball is against the rake. He or she moves the rake. The ball moves with the rake. The player is going to replace the ball as where that mark was and play the ball from its original position. You're not going to play the ball from where it came to rest after you move that movable obstruction.
Gotcha. And one follow-up on the gate. If a gate is part of a boundary object, you can move the gate, but you cannot get free relief from the gate. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's part of the boundary object, and as Kirby, I believe Kirby mentioned in the previous webinar, a boundary object does not entitle us to relief. So you're not going to get relief from a boundary object, but a movable obstruction within that boundary object is a different ballgame.
Gotcha. All right. Looks like we're good for this section. If you want to keep going there, Neil.
Great. So loose impediments, we talked about them earlier, but we'll get a little more in depth about them. So any stones, loose grass, leaves, branches, or sticks. Pine straw is another one that's pretty common as a loose impediment. But dead animals or animal waste, you can see here are loose impediments. Worms, insects, or similar animals that can be easily removed. I always find this slide interesting, as in the bottom right of our screen, you see a scorpion down there as you know, an animal that is in a loose impediment. I might make the case to see if that's a dangerous animal condition, but that's a different story. Or the mounds or webs that they build. Again, we've already talked about the worm cast or anthills that may be there after a rainstorm and they're dug into the ground. But again, we've defined those as loose impediments. And we talked about aeration holes earlier not being part of ground area under repair. However, if the aeration plugs are out there still, or clumps of compacted soil, those are going to be loose impediments, and you may move those. Such natural objects are not loose if they are attached or growing, solidly embedded in the ground, or sticking to the ball. So you can all remember Tiger Woods and moving that big boulder. Well, that was one big loose impediment. And in our example here, we have a ball that has adhering mud to it. Unfortunately, that is not that is not a loose impediment. There are a few special cases. Sand and loose soil are not considered loose impediments. Dew, frost, water, also not considered loose impediments. And snow and natural ice, like we talked about earlier, are either loose impediments or temporary water at the player's option. You actually have an option of how you want to handle that situation should you run into snow or natural ice. And then one little anomaly, spider webs are loose impediments even though they are attached or adhering to another object, as you can see in our example there. Jason, I think that brings us to an end of what we wanted to cover today. Do you have any additional questions?
I've got one lined up here. Would a worm casting attached to a ball be considered a loose impediment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would love to see each example of one of these. However, that would not meet the definition of loose impediment in a broad sense. There's part of it that you can move so long as the ball doesn't move and your removal of that loose impediment. However, that you no longer have a loose impediment if it is adhering to the ball.
Gotcha. Well, it looks like we're a little light on questions, so while we wait for maybe a few more to trickle in, just want to remind everyone that this is part 1 of 2. Part 2 is going to be tomorrow at the same time, 10 a.m., so make sure to register for that when you get the chance. And if you have any questions that pop in your head in between now and tomorrow, feel free to ask them tomorrow, as we can always revert back to what we were talking about today. Again, another reminder is that today's webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the GAP website by the end of today. Neil, it's looking like those questions are petering out here, so just want to thank you again, and Kirby and Chris as well, for joining us today and helping answer those questions and presenting Again, tomorrow, 10 a.m., part 2, with Neil presenting again.